Living compassion. Welcome back to Weekly Wisdom. I'm Pastor Cheryl. Compassion means to suffer with. So, as we consider that definition, to suffer with, as we hear these words from the first epistle of John, third chapter, beginning with verse 13. Don't be surprised, brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that you have transferred from death to life because we love the brothers and sisters. The person who does not love remains in death. Everyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that murderers don't have eternal life residing in them. This is how we know love. Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. But if someone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but refuses to help, how can the love of God dwell in a person like that? Little children, let's not love with words or speech, but with action and truth. This is how we will know that we belong to the truth and reassure our hearts in God's presence. Even if our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts and knows all things. Dear friends, if our hearts don't condemn us, we have confidence in relationship to God. We receive whatever we ask from him because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him. This is his commandment that we believe in the name of his son, Jesus Christ, and love each other as he commanded us. Those who keep his commandments dwell in God, and God dwells in them. This is how we know that he dwells in us, because of the Spirit he has given us. We keep God's command, Jesus' specific command, to love our neighbor, to love God's children, our brothers, our sisters, our siblings, our kinfolk in humanity, in God's creation. So here we hear this from John as he is writing, and he's writing a word of encouragement to live in the world, but out of the world. Live in it, participate in it, live in the lives of other human beings, share in our common humanity and our common human experience, live amongst creation, caring and nurturing it, bearing responsibility for it. But this is how we know love. By loving, not words, not speech, action and truth. We're not called to belong to speech. Verse 19 says, this is how we will know that we belong to the truth and reassure our hearts of God's presence. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus also said, when asked, what's the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so when we think about loving our neighbors as ourselves, that doesn't mean we impose what we want or what we desire upon them, but that we actually enter into their condition, following up on our conversation last week about empathy. We enter into their lives and we live compassionately, which means we suffer with. The Bible talks about weeping with those who weep and rejoicing with those who rejoice. Entering into one another's lives, sharing in one another's lives. Isn't that what the incarnation is? Isn't that what the passion of Christ is about? God entering into, not from a distance looking on, not, not considering from afar, not just listening, entering into conversation and dialogue, but entering into the life. I'm reflecting on this in a particular way in the aftermath of the shootings in Atlanta that largely targeted our siblings who are part of the AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders community. And when we think about what that community has gone through, it's another pandemic. That's another aspect of brokenness that in some ways has been illuminated, it's been brought to light by this pandemic, but it's also, I mean, in terms of exposure, but it's also been amplified by it, by rhetoric that encourages violence towards AAPI persons, particularly targeting the most vulnerable, targeting the elderly, where you have AAPI siblings who are afraid of what their grandparents will experience going about their daily lives, living in the world, as most of us should be able to just take for granted. And certainly all of us should be able to, but most take for granted being able to go to the grocery store or run your errands or live your life in safety and peace, the same way that African American men and women, particularly younger ones, are targeted for racialized violence. AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, are targeted, particularly the elderly, for violence because we are blaming them. And this was part of the previous presidential administration, actively blaming them for a global pandemic in which they, as all of us, are equally suffering. I shouldn't say that because we're not equally suffering. Because we share, we may be living under the same or similar conditions. We share the commonality of the condition. The virus doesn't discriminate, but the ways in which we discriminate as a society and culture amplifies the suffering of particular communities. That's why Black and Brown communities and the health disparity, the disparities in the in health and healthcare system particularly impacts those communities. The disparities in the labor market, educational opportunities, all of those things, the ways in which Black people aren't believed at the same rate, in the same ways as white people, the same ways that Brown people aren't taken seriously or not heard, the language barriers that sometimes can take place in ethnic and racially diverse populations. All of those things conspire to make the pandemic markedly worse for communities of color. And in addition to that, and certainly our Native American and First Peoples, Indigenous communities experience all of those things, all of them as well. But in a particular way, this pandemic has given people an excuse to target Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with hate, with violence. And too often it's not even being reported. Again, if we didn't have social media and these devices that we use in order to record the things that are happening, the fact of the matter is that these communities, these marginalized communities, have to tell their own stories because they're not being told. Because they're underrepresented in around the tables of decision making. So even though you see one or two individuals in front of cameras to make you feel that there is true diversity, inclusion means more than, and those are strides that are important and they're also necessary, but that's not the end of the work. Because the reality is, how can you have compassion if you don't know someone's suffering? Too often, the voices who are suffering the most are being silenced by others. We don't get to hear the stories. We have to seek them out. That's part of what it means to live compassion. To seek out the stories that you don't know, to hear the voices. Part of the benefit of reading, occasionally I'll be on Twitter, and someone will ask for resources. They're looking at a particular topic, and they will ask if people know resources that come from particular communities. And inevitably, someone will say, "Well, why is this important? What difference does it make?" And unfortunately, but typically, the person asking that is a white male, because and I bring this up to bring up a truth that needs to be told, is that when you are the part of the dominant culture, you do not see unless you deliberately, intentionally open your eyes. You do not see the world from any other lens, because the dominant lens that is portrayed is one that is from your perspective. And so that's the reason they're asking the question, is the answer. It does make, because it makes a difference. And if you had experience in hearing from Latinx theologians or from Native American pastors, and this is just looking at it from a Christian perspective, or if you were to immerse yourself in Asian, and let's be clear, Asia is the largest continent on the face of the earth. I mean, we look at our maps, and even our maps show that. That you look at Asia, if we look at landmass, Asia and Africa dwarf the rest of the landmass, if we look at accurate projections. And the Asian Pacific Islander community is not monolithic. There are so many variations. And so, to look at the Philippines is different than Korea, and it's different than China, different than Japan, it's different than the Pacific Islands like Fiji, and even when you go to Hawaii and experience that. I remember going to a luau that showcased various Polynesian cultures, and so those Pacific Island cultures, and the vast diversity just in that. But it also includes India, and it encompasses so much more than we realize, and there's so many variations and so much richness in that. And instead of embracing that, it's being demonized in a really particular way right now that is causing generational harm to that community, and a community that has experienced harm so often. They're erased. When the statistics are out, you see statistics when race that are broken down by race. You'll see African Americans, you'll see Latino, Latinx, um, Hispanic numbers, but often Asian Americans are just sort of lumped in or just assume there's no variation or just ignored. The same, even more so with Native American communities. But if we could only learn to live with compassion, to suffer with, when we see things happening in the world, we would have an entirely different perspective. Because what do you do when you suffer? When you personally suffer? Think about that for a second. What do? You try to fix it. You seek help, you learn about it, you look at your options, you pray. I mean, every resource, every tool that we have to deal with in our own situations, our own life circumstances of struggling, that's what we need to bear when we see others struggle. And that's living compassion. It's more than words, it's more than speech. It's in action and in truth. That's what it takes to heal, to enter into suffering in all ways that we can. But that also doesn't mean trying to take over or trying to tell communities what they should do. It's listening, it's bringing the resources that you have to bear to help fix the problem, but it's following the lead. I I am reminded that when you're dealing with someone who has a problem, the first thing you have to do is ask them questions and seek a greater understanding of what they're experiencing. But you have to put them at the center of that conversation and dialogue. And so even with a lot of these conversations that are being had in our various siloed communities, I know a lot of white people having conversations, really faithful conversations, hopeful conversations around race, around white privilege, around white nationalism, and what they can do. And they're having them at times very intentionally with themselves in order to not cause additional harm as they educate themselves. But when you do that, um, make sure you're centering Black voices. Make sure you're centering AAPI voices. Make sure you're centering Native voices. Make sure you're centering Latina or Latinx voices so that you're hearing from the people who are being harmed. And that might be engaging people from those communities who are engaged in this work to lead you through that process. So it's not going to your coworker who happens to be, or your neighbor, that person that you know who happens to belong to that community, and expecting them to speak on behalf of the community. If they are comfortable sharing their experience, hear that, listen, affirm it, engage in that, appreciate that. But I'm talking about there are people who are out there doing this work that you can engage with and do this work, and who will help lead you in these conversations um, from a from the perspective that will enable you to see and hear from a first account experience. There are also those who've written books. Um, you know, one thing that I'll say is that it's hard to get published when you're in marginalized communities. Um, but you tend to be able to get more books, more works, articles are published when you're talking about your particular experience as a member of these groups. So it's it's hard to find um, resources on a topic, you know, that's not related to race, um, that's written by someone from um, a racially marginalized group. But, and I say marginalized, not minority, because the vast majority of people in the world are people of color. And so I'm moving away from that. I'm moving away from that language that suggests an inferiority based on numbers. The truth of the matter is, compassion says, doesn't matter, minority, majority doesn't matter. Humanity does. Love does. Our shared life does. Compassion does. And so if there's one, that's enough to want to make things better, to heal. So I say all that to say that living compassion takes effort, it takes work, it takes intentionality, it takes grace. And one of the things that I believe that, as particularly among Christians, that we have not, we receive the grace of God theoretically. We believe we're forgiven for our sins theoretically. But we don't really embrace grace fully, because if we embrace grace in its fullness, we'd be more graceful with ourselves, which would allow us to take the risk necessary to live out a gospel life, a life that demonstrates the good news. Because the good news is I can enter into the lives of others, even knowing I'm going to mess up, I'm going to make mistakes, I may even offend. But if I do, I'm going to extend grace to myself. That doesn't make me a bad person. That just means that I did something that just gives me an opportunity to learn from that experience and to do better the next time. To say I'm sorry for the harm that I've caused, the harm that has been caused that I've benefited from, because so often the response is, well, I didn't do that. I don't, I wasn't involved with the Trail of Tears, the or the annihilation of millions of native people from these lands that we reside upon. Or I didn't have slaves, or I wasn't involved with the internment of the Japanese during World War II. But there's racism is more than isolated events. It is systematic, institutionalized ways of being. It's more than prejudice. It is infused the systems and the institutions of this nation, as well as many others around the world, for centuries, if not millennium. And there are those who benefit from that still, and there are those who are still harmed by that. And compassion says, if I'm a beneficiary, that means I have something that I can bring to help heal the harm that's done, to help alleviate the suffer, and that I suffer even as I benefit. Because don't believe for a second that racism, that white supremacy does not also harm white people. It causes tremendous harm. It may not be material, but it is certainly spiritual, it is emotional, it is relational, it's intellectual. And that's just on a personal level. We're not even talking about um, sort of the loss of the loss of potential and promise that could have benefited all of society, all culture, all of creation, because someone who should have been inventing had to struggle just to survive. Someone who should have been leading struggled to maintain their self-worth and identity in a world that tried to destroy them. Compassion says this cannot be, and I cannot let it. So let us live compassion, live it in our lives, enter into the lives of others, enter into the human condition of our siblings, and make things better to heal. God bless you and keep you. God make God's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. To the next time that we join together again, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself with compassion.